Thanks and welcome everyone to the September 22nd Training Skills That Make Great Board Members. I have been waiting a long time to find a training that combines the basics and skills of land use regulation plus the human side of the people making the decisions. And I got to tell you, this is it. This is the training. And so often when board members are appointed to a board, you're given the task of implementing a town's land use regulations, a village's land use regulations, a county's land use regulations, and you say, what's next? What am I supposed to do? You may not have had exposure to land use before you got on the board. Well, this training takes you through what is expected, and also it reassures you that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Everything you need to know is in existence now. If your town or village has land use regulations in zoning, subdivision regulations, comprehensive plan, you have what you need. It tells you how to do your job and what's expected of you. And so we'll go through tonight with the Department of State members here and kind of go through that human element, but also go and touch on the basics of planning. What I found great about the slides in this course is that it's wonderful for new members, but it's also a good refresher for seasoned members as well. And so we have with us tonight Chris Eastman, Ebony Mapp, Paula Gilbert, and David Jacobson from the New York State Department of State Division of Local Government. And so I'm excited for you to be here, and I'm excited for us to go through this together. So take it away, Chris.
Thanks, Heather. We're excited to have you as a booster for this course. It's I believe only the second time we're presenting it. It was put together earlier this year at the request of a county planner who had the same goals that you do for the course. And with that introduction, I'm thinking we might need a field office in Livingston County. That was a really great pitch to the importance of board members sticking to what they have and really understanding it. We're up to 70 attendees, and I think I'll just let Ebony get started. She's really doing the first slides, but I wanted to thank you for having us. The smaller county-wide county workshops, we're kind of mimicking our usual schedule this year by webinars. Usually we attend large conferences, day conferences throughout the year that include Genesee Finger Lakes and Southern Tier West and Southern Tier Central, the Potsdam Local Government Day and other conferences like that, but also county workshops on weekday evenings, which are always very popular, and there's a level of intimacy that encourages interaction between the presenters and the attendees. And webinars are tough, especially the ones that we do for a statewide audience that have hundreds of people on them. We did a series of those in the spring, and we'll do a series of those in the fall at the end of December and beginning of January. And winter webinars, we'll do them at the end of December, and then the two overview courses in the beginning of January geared to brand new members. And those are not as much fun as a presentation like this, because there are always a lot of people on those, and we're going to try to encourage interaction. And for those of you who have questions and have comments, you can use the chat function. If you click on the chat button at the top of the right side of your screen, the chat box will open. Don't use question and answer. The chat is a little more convenient. And direct your questions and comments to host, presenter, and panelists. If you bring the drop-down menu down and scroll up, it's the fourth option down. And we'll maybe stop at some point to address some of the questions, and we hope we'll have time at the end as well, and maybe we'll even have time for to unmute some people if there's more that you have to say. And we hope Heather speaks up later in the course anyway. So I'm going to hand the control of the screen over to Ebony, who's really going to get us started here.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes,
okay.
I can.
Okay, well, let's get started. First, we'll start off with some rules of the road, so bear with me as I give our spiel. You should hear us speaking. If not, check your audio settings in the drop-down at the top of the program window. Obviously, if you can't hear me speaking, then you can't hear this. But feel free, if you're hearing me going in and out or something like that, put in a question to our moderators or to our hosts, and they will help you get situated. In any case, if it's still not working, log out and log back in, but try not to log in and out too many times. That does mess with our records, indicating who came into the meeting. We do keep a very meticulous records. The system does provide us with that, but if you log out too many times, it can kind of give us mush in the on the back end in our data set that we have to then sift through. So please don't do that. We are not IT professionals. We are off-site, as many of you already know, as many of us are still living in this world where we're working from home. But in this particular case, it means that we cannot assist with technical issues on your end. So please be mindful of that. We'll do our helpers, David and Paula, will do what they can. Chris and I as well will do what we can. But again, we're not IT professionals, and so we are limited in that regard. To ask questions, please use the chat feature and choose host, panelists, and presenters. It's the fourth option down in the chat box, or all panelists. We will try to answer as many questions as time permits. If we cannot, you can always email us for technical assistance at localgov@dos.ny.gov. And
I think we lost Ebony's audio. Ebony, can you hear me?
We may be.
Oh. Okay, sorry about that. Maybe it was at my end. Sorry.
No, she went online too, but you're back. Good.
Okay. Okay.
Sorry, I lost you again.
Able to answer all the questions and so what happens. What we will be emailed. We do have some data about who comes in and if you log in or not, and so that's the case. WebEx is watching. Those who log in late or leave early may only receive partial credit, because we can keep track of when you come in and how long you stay. We can also keep track of how much attention you're paying, whether you're paying attention to what's on your screen. So please keep that in mind, and just be studious for the next 2 hours. And we hope that you enjoy what we have to talk to you about today. First, we're going to talk a little bit about the census. We all know it's very important. It's top of mind right now on a lot of news stations because of some of the controversies surrounding federal government right now, and the pandemic, and people getting counted and all of that. It's critical. It's important. It happens every 10 years. It is a count of every resident living in the United States. It's mandated by our U.S. Constitution, and again, it's conducted every 10 years, ending in 0 since 1790. That is a long-standing tradition that we are actively trying to continue and keep it going so that we can all be counted. The goal is to count everyone once and count them in the right place. The 2020 census is critical to New York's future. Again, it's been in the headlines for quite some time, and especially right now. It's important because it impacts $53 billion in federal funding that goes to community services and economic development in your municipality and in municipalities throughout the state, and of course across the country. It impacts the number of congressional and redistricting, the number of congressional seats and redistricting. So you know, it may impact how many representatives New York State has in Congress in the following years. So it's critically important for us to all be counted. Data is also used for planning by government and businesses and nonprofits and researchers. I mean, this data that the census puts together and populates their website with is used by just people like countless organizations around the country and around the world. And so again, it's very critical that this be accurate information, right? So we can know what our country actually looks like and what it looks like economically, what it looks like demographically, et cetera. But there are some challenges. There are some hard to count communities. This is something that the census deals with on a regular basis. Every 10 years, it's still a challenge. And those hard to count communities are in urban and rural areas. Some of those communities are low-income communities. Historically, children under 5 are very difficult to count, especially because, you know, someone may not think to include an infant, or maybe it's a child that maybe has parents that don't live in the same household, and so depending on who you get one day, that child may be counted. You know, who the enumerator or who fills out the census that day may count that child, and then that child may not be counted in another household, or may be counted twice in another household. So those are challenges to the process. Also, seniors, they may not have an understanding of the census, or their faculties may be diminished in some way, and they may not remember or have the capacity to complete the census correctly. Also, limited English proficiency speakers, or people who speak other languages and do not speak English at all, or do not speak English well, or not proficient or fluent in English, may have trouble filling out the census. They may have trouble understanding that the census isn't even important. They also may have trouble understanding that the census is not something that is something to be afraid of, right? Also, folks that have non-traditional housing, like transient populations, that could be anywhere from someone who is traditionally what we would consider homeless to someone who is, for all intents and purposes, couch surfing. Maybe they don't have their own residence and they're moving from place to place as you know, needs change or circumstances in their life evolve. Also, a major challenge is access to technology. There's quite a few populations that have limited computer skills, whether we're talking about seniors or other folks, and other folks that have limited access to the internet. We all talk about broadband and how important that is, the expanse of broadband is to all of our communities, particularly those in rural areas. But again, even in urban areas, it's an issue. We see that now in this pandemic life that we've all been living for the last 6 months, where kids are, you know, having to sit outside of a McDonald's parking lot, you know, to do their homework to get on the Wi-Fi. So it's an issue that really impacts just about every community. But again, these are some of the challenges that make it difficult to have to ensure a full and accurate count. A lot of these dates have already passed. This is the census timeline. So you should have received an invitation to respond to the census. To do so online. You may have received letters over the last few months, and I'm sure we were all at home at the time, so we would have gotten those letters. But if you haven't responded yet, or if you know people that have not responded yet, please make them aware of the census website. There is still that opportunity. It's running out very quickly, as I understand, at the end of the month. That'll be it. Enumerators are on board. They're out in the field, going door to door, knocking on doors for people who have not responded to the census forms, to those letters, and to those postcards that were sent out with the online address to do the census, and the letters that asked people to please do the census and included the form on the inside of those letters. If you didn't do that, those enumerators are there knocking on the doors to try to get those folks to answer. And one key date to keep in mind here is April 1st. That's National Census Day. Of course, that's already passed, but it is the date to keep in mind because you should count, if you have not done the census, you should count where you were living on April 1st as your place of residence to do the census. And then 2021 is when The final enumeration will be sent to the White House. Now, traditionally, that's sent on December 31st, New Year's Eve. But, of course, because we've had the pandemic and a lot of disruptions to our lives in a variety of ways, the census has not been an exception to that. And so the deadline to submit those final numbers was pushed back to April 29th, 2021. But the time is running out to get yourself counted if you haven't already done so, or if you know people that haven't. So please spread the word. New York is progressing. It's doing better in terms of its response rate, but it is not. It's pretty low. It's pretty low on the ranking. It's about 33rd out of all states in the country for its response rate. This says it was 62.5% on September 13th. As of September 20th, it was 63%, lower than the overall U.S. response rate of 61.1 at this point. Although on the 13th it was 65.7. So we still have a long way to go. We're not quite that far behind the rest of the country, but again, 65 or 63% is not 100%. We want everyone to be counted because it makes a difference in whether we'll be able to continue to have the kind of community services and programs that we all need funded for all of our communities across the state, as well as have full representation in Congress. So that's what matters. We want to get to that 100% or as close to it as possible, given the circumstances. Here's more information. Feel free to go to the census website to complete the census online if you have not done so, or direct any of your loved ones or friends that you may know that has not completed it, or anyone that may be considered a hard to count or come from a hard to count community that we mentioned earlier. Feel free to direct them to this website or go with them through the website and help them. You can be their own personal enumerator if you like. Here's more information here for the U.S. Census website, so feel free to go to that website and peruse. You can see all of the different data sets from past census counts, and that's from New York State to other states, to at the county level, to the municipal level. There's a wealth of information on that website, so I would encourage you to go on there and play around. It's quite interesting. If you have questions about completing the census, you can call the U.S. Census Bureau at the number listed on the screen to speak with the local Census Bureau representative. If you feel that you've been scammed or someone has attempted to scam you, the New York State Division of Consumer Protection is the place to go. Call their hotline so that you can report that scam. We want to be aware of it and try to prevent that from happening to other people. So please feel free to call that line if you think that you've been scammed or someone has tried to scam you. And with that, I will hand it over to Chris to get us started.
Thanks, Ebony. And before I do, I'm going to give Heather an opportunity to say something about the census progress in Livingston County and the Finger Lakes, the surrounding Finger Lakes counties, if she would like. Heather, do you have anything to add to what Ebony just told us about the census? Oops. You unmuted and then you muted, and
There I am.
Yes.
Sure, I can take a second for a quick census.
Sure, great.
So census in Livingston County, we're at 64%. Right now I checked the response rate today, so we're at 64%. And just some ways that we are getting the word out. We received a grant from Empire State Development for doing some census outreach. So if you see buses around for the LATS buses, for the RTS buses, and they say fill out your census, that's part of that grant working. We're actually looking to get pictures of those in the wild. So if anybody has a picture of a LATS bus taken very safely and not while driving, if you could send it to me, I would be most appreciative. But I just wanted to alert you and to give kudos to some out-of-the-box thinking for getting the census word out. And that's to Felipe over in Genesee County in the planning department. And their folks over there had an ice cream bus going around. And Felipe had the ice cream hat on, and he had the whole get-up. And he'd go to fairs and he'd give out free ice cream and then give the census message as well. I thought it was brilliant. I'm pretty particular to ice cream sandwiches myself. And I think in 10 years, I'm going to probably swipe that idea as well. I mean, emulate it and give total credit to Genesee County. So there is some good thinking outside the box here. And really, the final push, the next 8 days, you know someone who hasn't done their census, get the word out. It's so important for us, especially in Western New York. Thanks.
Thank you, Heather, and thanks for sharing the Genesee County, that great story. Well, for those of you who are on your boards, and we know that there are a number, I took a very informal poll early on before we officially started. I'm not going to take another. I know that we have a number of veterans in our audience, people who have been on their boards for a number of years. And so you probably realize that the power to regulate land is at the local level. We get a lot of calls at the Department of State from local officials and the general public alike who think that the state has authority to come in and intervene in local affairs, and the state does not. New York is a home rule state that has given the authority to regulate land to its local governments, and that is where the action is. And as many of you know, the decisions you make have a long and lasting impact on your community, and that is probably among the reasons you are on your board. Many of you are community-minded, and your planning board and zoning board of appeals are the stewards of the law that your local governing board passes, and you're responsible for administering it. Effective board members know that they have a lot of responsibility. There are the very basics of how your authority is given to you and what you have authority to regulate, and then how the board functions, and you have to find out where to find the answers to the questions that you might have as you're going along, and how to amend problematic laws. It's humbling to me as a trainer of these subjects to meet some of the longtime board members and experience the knowledge, the great knowledge, the depth of knowledge that they have about serving on their board. There's a lot to know, and many longtime board members gather it in the years that they serve. They're just standards of decision making that are in your law. The legal aspects of board conduct that are in statute that include the rules of procedure that you might have governing your local board. And then, of course, your policies that are written into the comprehensive plan, the extent of your zoning regulations, site plan review, subdivision regulations, and if you have special use permit authority, that as well. And then you're expected to learn how to read plans and maps and site plans, subdivision plats, and to envision what you see on paper will look like when built. Another really important component to being an effective board member is keeping up to some degree with what's happening around you and communities around you, and just in development, what development patterns are, and what some of the trends in planning are, both regionally and beyond, because sometimes some of those strategies can be brought closer to home. And really effective board members know about what's happening beyond their hometown. So one of the critical skills to being an effective board member is curiosity, and another is a sense of commitment to your community. We often say, and we've heard many local officials express an understanding that land use control, the authority that local governments have to control land use, is one of the most important functions of local government. I notably heard the mayor of Albany say this at the launch of a revision to the city's zoning regulations. She said, one of the most important things we can do as local officials is to have effective land use control. And so that's something that not a lot of people understand, that really is in your hands as local officials to administer and your local governing boards to adopt. And of course, land use decisions can be highly controversial because they can be seen as having winners and losers, and there's the possibility that if really held to the fire, a developer might have to spend more money. A developer or landowner might have to invest more than initially budgeted into a project to meet the criteria of your local regulations. And those regulations wouldn't be there if they weren't for good reason, to protect the environment and to assure community character is maintained. And if you look at your local paper, one of my instructors in graduate school did this for us. He'd come into class every day with a local paper, and he'd point to all of the stories that pertain to land use. So you've got an example right there on your screen, just of a few local stories that pertain to land use that happen to be in the Capital District from the Times-Union, I think. So not everybody understands that, and it's important for you as local officials. One thing you could do to is educate the general public about what you do. Somebody asked me, I was at a meet and greet at the local business improvement district in the city where I spend a lot of time, not Albany, and I won't say which city, but the local business improvement district had an event, and somebody who runs a PR firm at that event asked me what I did, and I told him that I trained local officials in land use planning and regulation, and he feigned a yawn. He pretended to yawn and put his hand over his mouth as if he was telling me that my job was really boring. Well, little did he know that what I do, I'm proud of what I do, and you all should be proud to be members of your planning boards and zoning boards of appeals. What we do is pretty important for our community. And this was at a function of the business improvement district. So business improvement districts are closely related, their work, and he's on the board of that organization. They're closely related to planning and land use and downtown revitalization. So you probably all know, most of you, the local government team and their roles in the work of reviewing applications and the relationship that your board has to them. The municipal clerk is sometimes on the front line and distributes applications and is really the person who first comes into contact with applicants to your boards. And then, of course, the clerk. So the clerk handles the very beginning and the very end of your business meeting, having that first contact with applicants and posting meetings and then filing your minutes and decisions. And then your board secretary might be might be that front-end person, that gatekeeper to the applications, and should have some knowledge of what makes for a complete application, so that you're not wasting your time. You're not reviewing materials that don't contain sufficient information for you to make a decision. The code official could also be that frontline person, because usually it's the code official who makes the determination of whether an application just needs a permit or needs to go in front of the planning board for site plan review, or denies an application because it doesn't meet the dimensional requirements of the zoning, or interprets or doesn't think that it meets the use requirements, and which results in an interpretation or an appeal for use variance for the in front of the Zoning Board of Appeals. Then, of course, many small local governments don't have planning departments, but larger municipalities do, and you have your county planners to provide support to you, and of course have to refer 239M applications that come under the 239M requirement to your county planning agency. And then there's more support with your municipal attorney, maybe a consulting engineer, and the city mayor, village mayor, town supervisor, your administrator, the chief administrator of your municipality. In addition to those people, the applications that come in front of the planning board might have requirements to refer to the fire chief, the highway superintendent, and the Department of Public Works potentially, to be sure that conditions are, that they have input so that conditions can be factored into approval of your application. So another skill to have in knowing your local government team is to know who to go to for what, and what they can provide to the application process. Just a little on the local governing board before I hand the screen back to Ebony. Your city council, village board of trustees, and town board are your local legislature, and they have police power to adopt local laws and policy, local laws in the form of site plan, subdivision, regulations, and zoning, and policy in the form of the comprehensive plan, and of course other local laws, that some of which pertain to land use review. And then their administrative role, of course, includes setting budgets and maintaining local infrastructure, drafting and maintaining agreements, and setting and following purchasing and procurement policies. The local governing board, the town board, also appoints members to the planning board and zoning board of appeals. In villages, it's the village mayor with approval of the board of trustees, and in cities, it's the mayor. So back to you, Ebony.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. So now we'll talk about the primary functions of a planning board. Now, the planning board plays both a regulatory and advisory role in local government, and both apply to how land is used. So in their advisory role, they can make official comments on any land use matter, whether asked or not. As a planning board member, or as a planning board rather, you have the ability to kind of stick your nose into other matters, but as long as it relates to planning issues or land use issues. That could be with regard to letting the governing board know that it's time to review or update your comprehensive plan, It could be in advising the ZBA on a variance application. Although the ZBA has decision power, the planning board can weigh in and provide an opinion. And then, of course, there's any other additional powers that are assigned by the governing board. Now, with regard to the regulatory powers, that's where the governing board authorizes the planning board to review and make decisions regarding site plans or subdivisions or special use permits. And let me just kind of make one distinction here. Subdivision regulations are actually granted to, well, let me say it this way. Subdivision, the authority to decide on subdivision applications comes from New York State statute. So that's where that one piece of regulatory power comes from, but all the others are delegated to the planning board by the governing board. Now, with regard to the ZBA only has a regulatory role, but there's a key distinction in how it's carried out. They have both what's called an appellate and an original jurisdiction. Now, appellate jurisdiction basically is when the ZBA is deciding on matters that have been referred to them. That could be one of two things: interpreting zoning regulations, which is basically where the zoning enforcement officer has made a decision about it, whether something should be allowed or can be done on a particular site, and the person applying for the permit or what have you is denied or disagrees with the determination made by the zoning enforcement officer. They then go to the ZBA to say, hey, can you interpret this? Can you give me an official interpretation of what this regulation is saying that I have to do, because I disagree with what, or I disagree, or I have a difference of opinion from that of the zoning enforcement officer, and that is called a zoning interpretation. Another matter that is considered appellate in nature that the ZBA will decide on are variances, whether that be a use variance or an area variance. So when they're deciding on an appeal for a variance, that is all appellate, right? Those are matters that are referred to the ZBA. All ZBAs have appellate jurisdiction, all of them. But some ZBAs also have what's called original jurisdiction, and those are matters that starts or originates with the ZBA themselves. So it's not referred to them from the zoning enforcement officer. It's not referred to them from the planning board or from anyone else. It's a power to review something that comes straight from the governing board. So that may be a special use permit or site plan review. Those are typically what you tend to see. ZBA should not be deciding on subdivisions, because remember, just a moment ago, I said that the subdivision, the authority to review subdivisions comes from the state statute, and they give that right, and New York State statute gives that right directly to planning boards, not anyone else. Moving on. Rules of procedure. Well, any board worth their salt should govern themselves in an orderly manner, right? And one great way to do that is by establishing rules of procedure and then following them, right? Common sense, right? But generally, any kind of rules of procedure should lay out a number of things, like the duties. You know, those are the powers that you have and what you can review, right? It's kind of like your jurisdiction. Also, when and how agendas are set, when and how meetings are called, you know, and that's basically saying, okay, well, what's the order of business? You know, will we discuss new business, old business? What does that entail? When will we be setting an agenda? Will it happen at the end of a meeting in preparation for the next meeting? Will it happen sometime in between? What's the schedule for our meetings? Will they be upon demand, or will they be on a monthly basis, the second Tuesday of every month, etc.? That should be in your rules of procedure. They should also outline acceptable conduct by all attendees at the hearings and meetings. So not just the conduct of the board, but of course the conduct of the people in the audience, so to speak. In the sense that in the rules of procedure, you'll indicate whether, you know, how much time each person may have to speak, how many people, not how many, but who can. And I know New York State does it a little bit differently. In my last municipality, out of which was in a different state. We did things a little bit differently, so I won't go into that to confuse you, but I'll just say this. It should at least tell you how much time someone who is in the audience that wants to speak on a given matter at a hearing, for instance, should be able to speak at the podium before their time runs out. Another thing that your rules of procedure should include, the timeline to draft and finalize your minutes, as well as the content of meeting minutes, like what that should include. It should also note who signs off on official documents. That could be your board chair, or if you're in a big enough municipality, it may be a director if you have a planning director. Most smaller municipalities do not have that, but if you do, that could be another person. The rules of procedure should also say under what circumstances and where applications should be referred to for additional review, whether that's a referral to the county or a referral to an adjacent municipality that may have some skin in the game, so to speak, on a particular application because of their proximity to a site. Basically, your rules of procedure set clear standards for how business should be conducted, right? And having a working knowledge of those rules is good for both seasoned and new members alike, right? Everyone should know and understand their duties. And I'll just caution you, if you are a new board member, it is best to avoid mimicking other board members. You know, that whole like, I'll take you under my wing and I'll show you the ropes is great, but when it comes to just kind of understanding how the meeting should proceed, what the specific standards are for conduct, things like that, know the rules yourself, right? Because having and knowing the rules helps keep everyone sharp, right? Because if I'm relying on one person to know the rules, but they have forgotten something or conveniently forgotten something, right, purposefully forgotten to adhere to a specific standard, then then I will continue to repeat that same mistake going forward. And so if you know the rules, I can remind you, if I know the rules rather, I can remind you, hey, you forgot to do this, or hey, you forgot to do that. And again, knowing the rules will keep everyone sharp. No rules of procedure. If you're thinking this in your mind like, oh, well, I don't recall us having any of those types of things laid out, if you are so inspired or if you just feel guilty, ask us for some samples. We'll be happy to provide you with some from different municipalities so that you don't have to not necessarily copy them. That's not the goal, but you won't need to recreate the wheel, so to speak. Be ethical. Now, this really just goes without saying, right? Be ethical. You have, as a board member on a planning board or a zoning board of appeals, you have power, right? But you also have a responsibility to handle public business in a manner that is both professional and ethical. Your job is not just to make decisions, but it is also to promote confidence and trust when conducting public business. Your behavior makes a difference in how the whole process is perceived. Believe me, it definitely makes a difference. Even if you don't, most of the time, unless you have an application before the board, most of the public is not going to come to one of these meetings unless there's something controversial. But regardless, so you may be talking to an empty room most of the time when you have these meetings. But understand, those that are present, they are watching your behavior, and it gives kind of indications into whether they will perceive that their application will be handled fairly and appropriately. Okay, so your behavior definitely makes a difference in how the whole process is perceived. Being ethical is a very broad concept, but when we're talking about it, really what we're talking about are avoiding conflicts of interest, whether they be financial, contractual, or familial, like nepotism. But you may ask, how do you do that? Again, that's kind of broad. How do you avoid doing those things, or what does that look like in real life? Well, you do that you avoid conflicts of interest by disclosing any actual, apparent, or potential conflicts of interest that relates to any application or any violation that's in your authority to review. And you do that by recusing yourself in those situations where it's clear that there's an application in front of you that you are somehow connected to, either through the applicant or some type of financial investment or contractual relationship, etc. That's your opportunity to make it known that you have a connection to this and you need to recuse yourself and remove yourself from the decision-making process in this particular instance. And that's true even if it's not really a conflict of interest, but it just may appear to be. So you even want to avoid even the appearance of a conflict of interest, again, because your behavior makes a difference in how the whole process is perceived. You also want to avoid engaging in ex parte communication. And that's basically when you're talking privately to an applicant outside of the view of the public, right, about their request on an application. You also want to avoid acting in bad faith. And that's like, an example would be like creating unnecessary or unreasonable delays before deciding on an application, maybe by requesting multiple minor changes or information, successively, as opposed to just kind of doing a thorough review, asking for all that information at one time, and then having them come back with an update later on, doing it in an efficient manner. So if acting in bad faith, engaging in ex parte communication, those types of things can give the impression that this is there's some ulterior motive, and just, again, makes the process seem unfair and unethical. Every municipality has a code of ethics, so your municipality should have one. It may not have a board of ethics. I believe that is an optional thing from the state, but you do have to, by law, have a code of ethics that addresses conflicts of interest. So it's up to you to become familiar with it. Conflicts of interest, we'll talk a little bit more about that. I love this picture because I just look at this and the first thing I think is like, well, would I buy a hamburger from a cow? That means nothing. I don't know what like the relevance of that is, but it just makes me laugh because if I was this person, I would be afraid to eat that hamburger if I was buying it from a cow. But anyway, that's just an aside, excuse me. So how do you know whether something is a conflict of interest? Well, you could ask yourself whether, really the question you should ask yourself is not necessarily whether there is a conflict of interest, because obviously it may not be apparent, it may not be overt or obvious, but you should ask yourself, could there appear to be a conflict of interest? I mean, I don't remember the term that the actual phrase, but there's like a phrase that says, perception is reality or something like that. If it appears to be a conflict of interest, that may sink the whole ship, right? And again, you are responsible for, representing the municipality and your board with integrity, and so you don't want to do that. You always want to err on the side of caution and disclose any real or potential conflicts. It could be a business ties, personal connections, familial ties, any litigation that you're involved in that may be related to the case before you, and then recuse yourself. That means taking yourself out of the decision-making process for that particular application, as well as leaving the room, right, during deliberations and decision-making, and so that an alternate can serve in your place on that particular application. If nothing else, if it's challenged in the future, you can easily point to the record and say, hey, the board, we talked about it, that the board member tried to recuse themselves. The board agreed that it was not a conflict of interest, and we decided to move on. But it's best for you, the board member that believes that there may be the appearance of a conflict of interest, to state that plainly, so at least it could be discussed and deliberated on, a decision made, and then you can all move forward. But you should, but you also give yourself the opportunity to recuse yourself, just to be as make it as cut and dry as possible. You also want to avoid soliciting or receiving gifts, either directly or indirectly, from applicants or really anyone. I used to work with someone in my former life at the local level who worked for the mayor's office in that municipality, and she would go to different events and refuse even door prizes or giveaways. I mean, you can accept things that are like, let's say you go to a conference and they're giving away pens or keychains, things like that, the little collateral that they have. You can accept that. That's not a big deal. But, a $75 dinner, right, is something different. a $75, gift card or whatever, that's a different story. This particular person would not even take a door prize. That's kind of an extreme example, but she was adamant about her professional reputation, and I would recommend that you be too, because if you close the door, there's no room for anyone to have a credible assertion that you did something unethical, right? So it's best to just err on the side of caution with regard to that. And in general, you also want to, like I mentioned just a moment ago, avoid gifts that are worth $75 or more. It's best, just as a rule of thumb, to avoid taking anything beyond your, the pen, the magnet, the notepad, etc., that you might receive at like a conference or something. But just in general, good rule of thumb, don't take anything. Okay, I'll pass this on to Chris.
Thanks, Ebony, and good story about your colleague who was hyper-conscious of having a conflict of interest and taking gifts. We have a colleague like that at the Department of State, not in our division, but somebody who expressed concern about taking meals at meetings of local governments, and of course the dinners at our training events that some of our county planners provide are among the highlights of the evening for a lot of people, including me. And really good point about not emulating necessarily a longtime board member, although longtime board members almost always have a lot to offer. We encourage them to continue to be trained, because even longtime board members have sometimes developed bad habits and might not have ever learned the correct way of doing something. So that was a really good point too, Ebony. I'm going to violate here the first rule of public speaking and just really focus on the slide and read some of these points, because I can't describe what the comprehensive plan is better than these points. First off, there are sections of statute that guide the comprehensive planning process, and you know that we can say a lot about the comprehensive plan. We have a full course on the subject, so we won't spend too much time on it. It's an expression of a municipality's goals and recommended action to achieve those goals. So it's a policy document, not a law. And it's an outline for orderly growth, and I would add preservation. So the comprehensive plan prioritizes where growth should occur and where it shouldn't, and it's a means of stating the municipality's policies, goals, and standards. It's might be compiled by a special board or the planning board. The special board should, of course, include members from the planning board, but it's adopted ultimately by the governing board, and it's the basis of your land use decisions, and zoning should be in accordance with the comprehensive plan. I'm not going to go through all of these elements of a comprehensive plan. That's for the comprehensive planning course, and we do have a webinar on comprehensive planning that we recorded last spring, so you can find it on our website among our recorded webinars. And I will just add that among these elements, you should also add, under the sustainability, this is a subcategory of sustainability, both environmental sustainability and financial sustainability. We have in our Division of Local Government a local government efficiency component in which our colleagues assist local governments in maintaining services and low taxes through collaboration, sharing services with other municipalities, and sometimes consolidation occasionally to the county level. So if anyone has questions on this slide, type them into the chat box. I see there's a question in chat, which I'll get to in just a second. I just want to get through the comprehensive planning slides. Knowing your comprehensive plan, this is essential reading for new members, and longtime board members should revisit and reread their comprehensive plans. Your zoning regulations, your subdivision regulations, and other decisions should should have a basis in your comprehensive policy statements that your comprehensive plan make, and your decisions should strive to be in harmony with the goals. For example, if you have a large-scale housing development, be it a suburban style subdivision or multi-unit housing, whatever the character of your municipality, when senior housing is a goal, you should make sure you knowledge of what the goals of the comprehensive plan are to satisfy the needs that your municipality has identified. In one of our courses, we talk about the charge of spot zoning, and there was one municipality that in a low density zone changed the zoning to allow for senior housing on a small parcel, but preserved most of the land around it, and it was charged, the zoning change was charged by a neighbor as being spot zoning, and the court said one of the goals of the comprehensive plan was senior and affordable housing, both of which this zoning decision accomplishes, and the land around the senior housing is being conserved, and so that's consistent with the goals of the comprehensive plan to maintain low density development in this zone. So that's just one example of where a comprehensive plan played an important role. So a new development proposal without sidewalks or infrastructure for public transportation, when walkability and options to get around without a single occupancy automobile are goals, that should be factored in, and you should consider that in your decisions. So knowing the comprehensive plan is curiosity and studiousness are skills that planning board members in general should have. And I like the way this slide is described, caring for our comprehensive plans. They should have different termed goals, those that can be accomplished in the short term, medium term, and long term. Those not necessarily pie in the sky, but maybe those goals that take a little more time to achieve. And of course, a comprehensive plan, we talk about zoning only being as good as its enforcement, and your comprehensive plan is only as good as its implementation. So make sure you implement your plan when it's passed and it's consistent and your zoning is consistent with your comprehensive plan. Sometimes regulations, have your regulations kept up with your comprehensive plan and vice versa. Sometimes your regulations might be changed ahead of the comprehensive plan. A couple of years ago, I went to a conference on solar in the Hudson Valley, and the presenters asked at the beginning of the conference, who has amended your zoning to accommodate solar? And maybe 60 or 70% of the hands went up. And then they asked, how many have amended your comprehensive plans to accommodate solar? And maybe 2 hands in the whole audience of 200 or so, 250 people went up. So that was very telling about how a bunch of local governments had scrambled to adjust their zoning, but hadn't gotten around to adjusting their comprehensive plans. Usually the comprehensive plan leads and the zoning follows. You want to make sure that's the case too. I've experienced a few local governments that have just had ongoing comprehensive plans, and then when they finally adopt them, there isn't any money for implementation and the zoning doesn't keep up. But you get what I'm saying there. Zoning, at its very elemental, is the regulation of use, dimension, and density to avoid incompatible uses, conflicting incompatible uses. So If you are doing any of those things, regulating the use of land is the most controversial element of zoning, but if you're regulating the density or placement of structures on the site, that is technically zoning. We know that it's optional in New York State and not required, but if you are zoning, you must have a zoning board of appeals, and it is your zoning is adopted and amended by the local governing board. Zoning needs care as well, and they're signs of they're telltale signs of very old zoning regulations. I used to work with one in the small city of Rensselaer, where I used to work as a municipal planner across the river from Albany. We had zoning regulations that were about as old as I was at the time I worked there, not quite 20 years ago. And they referred to cabarets. Now, what is a cabaret? I didn't even know. I had to look in the definitions of cabaret. It's something that today we would call a nightclub or a bar. And some other examples of outdated terms that identify old zoning are video rental stores, auto laundry, which is kind of an antiquated term for car wash, and sometimes service stations. There are still those lucky places that have gas stations that local businesses that both sell gasoline and work on cars, but those unfortunately are fast disappearing, and these days most places where people get gas are 2 acres in size with multiple pumps and have huge convenience stores. So these are it's important, obviously, to keep up on terms and new technologies and challenges to your local regulations, to your local government, to the character of your communities. And solar is, of course, the classic use that came into that suddenly was upon us, and it started out as being very uncontroversial, and we saw a lot of places just saying, well, we don't have, solar isn't an allowed use in our zoning, and this is something I want to emphasize too before I finish the story. Make sure you have lots of definitions, and if you have the term or the line, the phrase, or similar uses, that's vague, and you should, if you have that term, if you have that phrase or similar uses, consider how you might add more definitions to your zoning regulations, because vagueness will result in drawn out disagreements and maybe interpretations in front of the Zoning Board of Appeals. Appeals for interpretations, which aren't the worst thing in the world, but the greater the number of definitions and the more specific they are, the better. And uses in your zoning, there should be a phrase in your zoning regulations that says all uses not expressly permitted are prohibited. So years ago, we had some controversy about hydrofracking, and there were a number of local governments said, well, we don't really want this, we're not comfortable with it, so we'll pass moratorium laws. Well, a lot of those, and we didn't even know, of course, there were papers written, legal studies written on that there was the ability of local governments to zone out mining, and that would have included fracking. And then there was ultimately the Court of Appeals case. But before that, a lot of local governments said, we need a moratorium law because we don't want fracking. We don't think we want fracking. And if you didn't allow that use, it wasn't, certainly if you didn't allow mining, you didn't allow this type of mining. And solar is another recent challenge. Not controversial if it's just going to be on the roofs of a few houses, maybe a couple panels in the backyard, on top of businesses, maybe on over parking lots, to support the as an accessory use for use to reduce the cost of electricity on the property. Who could disagree with that? So there were a bunch of local governments that didn't have solar in their laws, and they said, well, yeah, we can allow this, but they didn't actually amend their zoning. Then they had more of a challenge when people wanted to put solar panels in their front yards and when larger solar facilities started coming about. And now, of course, I'm sure most of our local governments have acted upon the solar boom that we're starting to experience. But more on that if there are questions. I'm going to just look at this question quickly. It pertains to ethics. Actually, I'm going to pass control of the screen back to Ebony, and I'll read the question while she is speaking, and then we will address it. Maybe she's already read it and can address it herself. Back to you, Ebony. And you're going to have to go to the next slide because I gave you control of the screen already.
Okay, yeah, I did not read that. I didn't realize there was a question.
Well, I'll read it. We'll get to it later. On to plans and maps. Don't let me pull you away from what your focus is.
Okay, so what you'll find in your service as a board member on a planning board or zoning board of appeals is that your review will usually include reading and understanding maps. There's nothing to be afraid of, and we're going to give you kind of a little brief overview of a couple of the different types that you will come into contact with. But generally, almost every application will require the inclusion of a map of some sort, even if it's just something like a vicinity map, just to help you get your bearings on where that site is within your actual community. One exception meaning like one application where it would not be likely that you'd have to read a map is with a zoning interpretation, right? Because you're just getting into the nuts and bolts of how a particular use is defined or a particular term is defined officially by your board. So a map obviously would not be necessary. But in all other cases, more than likely there'll be a map included as a part of the application documents. We all know what a map is in general, but there are many kinds and they serve different purposes. And as a board member on a land use board, right, you will encounter a variety in your service. Because maps do different things, the review process may require changes, so be sure to properly identify each map that comes before you by name it by type. So, and we'll get into this, but you might have a land survey. You want to identify what that is. If you have a stormwater, no, that's not what I want to say. You may have a land survey, you might have a site plan, you might have a vicinity map, you may have a zoning map. You want to just label those and identify it by name, and then of course with the date, because again, as you go through the review process, you may require changes to any of these maps, and or either corrections or more information to be included there, and you may get a new version in time. So you want to make sure that you're always dealing with the most correct version, the most current version, and so that's why it makes sense to both name and date those. And so now we'll take a look at a couple of examples. This is a planimetric map. It's basic, kind of like a Google map, just what you're seeing on the screen. It usually shows streets, names, roads, highways, and possibly building footprints. It's basically used as what I call a vicinity map, like I mentioned earlier. And it's just, again, a map that helps you get an understanding of where this site is in your community. And really, it should be a map that's a part of every application. You need to know every application that you have before you. You need to know where this site is in relation to your community. Where is it? Not just let's look at this one parcel, but where is it in the grand scheme of things? Where is it situated geographically? So it lets you know. So this type of map lets you know where the site is in your community from a bird's eye view. It's not an aerial map, but it is from a bird's eye view, and it just kind of lays out where it is in the community, like I've said about 5 times now. Topographic maps is another type of map that you'll come into contact with. It shows the topography or the terrain of the site. You could also call it shows the lay of the land, right? It uses contour lines to contour lines, excuse me. It uses contour lines to describe the steepness of the terrain, like a hill or a mountain that's on the site, or sometimes even the depth of a depression, like a valley or a ditch. In general, the closer the lines are together, the steeper the slope is. Topographic maps are a great tool. They're a way to both display and understand a three-dimensional image on a 2D or a flat sheet of paper. It uses contours that are spaced apart by a certain number of feet to measure steepness or depth, and that number of feet that those lines are separated by may vary depending on what else that map is trying to show. So it may not be uniform for every type of topographic map that you see, but depending on what it's trying to show, it may differ. So for instance, this map shows topography only, right? We're just seeing the slope here, but often topography maps topography is added to site plans to show hydraulic features of a site, so maybe flood hazard areas, water courses, water bodies that are on the site, existing features like wetlands, or proposed changes to the elevation. So those are other instances where you might see a topography overlaid onto or underlaid onto another plan that you may have to review. So depending on what the main point is of that plan that you have in front of you, it may be a site plan that's also showing it may also show grading. It may be a grading plan, grading and stormwater plan, and so it's telling you what the proposed changes to the elevation will be. You know, if they flatten out certain hills or fill in depressions on the sites to make it suitable for development. That is just another instance where you may have a topography map that is also doing double duty as something else. On this map, the contours are shown, looks like every 10 feet, and then it has these bolded lines here. They're called index lines, and they seem to be bolded every 100 feet. And again, it may vary depending on the type of map that you have. One thing I'll note really quickly is that if you want this to be uniform in some regard, because of course you're not going to need 100 feet distance, for every topography map that you come into contact with if you don't have like a mountain or a huge hill on that site, right? But if you're looking at grading plan, or you want to look at stormwater on a particular map, and you want that to be submitted by the applicant, you can dictate what the distance between, or the intervals between contour lines should be, if it needs to be 2 feet or 3 feet or whatever, to help you to have an accurate sense of what's happening on that property. You have the ability to do that. You just want to make sure that you make it clear on your checklist. And we always, always, always say you should have a checklist with your application so that your applicant knows exactly what the information is that you're requesting, right? For their particular application, for their request, they need to provide XYZ documents, and this is what those documents need to display on them. So if you have a checklist, you're in good shape. If you want to have kind of a uniform sense of what the map should show you in every application, you can be more specific and indicate that interval distance as well. Moving on, here's a municipal zoning map. You should be familiar with this. You may have seen this already if you've been to a meeting yet. We know that most of you guys are seasoned board members, and some of you are new, so most of you, I'm sure, have seen something like this before. The zoning map shows the various zoning districts across your community. It outlines the specific boundaries of each district as well. So you know the boundaries, or you know the shape of that particular district and where it starts and stops. The most common zones that you'll find on a zoning map are residential, commercial, and industrial, but it could also include a host of other types of districts. It could include an open space zoning districts. It could include overlays, special districts, like maybe you have an entertainment district. Maybe you have a corridor that is filled with entertainment options like restaurants, bars, dance clubs, theaters, etc. And that's your entertainment district for your community, and it may be within the central business district. You know, it may be a part of your downtown, but it does not take up the whole town. That could be a special district, and that could also have its own zoning designation and have a a different color and everything on the map. Usually these maps are color coded. It makes it easy, and labeled, of course. That makes it easy to identify districts at a glance. So that's just a little information about that. One other thing I'll mention too, you may be able to notice this just by looking at the list of zoning districts on this particular slide, but many municipalities, especially the larger you are, you may have multiple types of zoning districts, or multiple zoning districts within a category of zoning districts. By that I mean you may have residential zoning districts, but you may have several of them. You may have a low intensity residential, right? You may have higher intensity zoning residential zones. So you may have an R1 and an R2 and an R3 district. You may have a B1 and a B2 and a B3 district. Those are like your business or your commercial districts. You may have light industrial or heavy industrial, I1 and I2. So just keep that in mind. I mean, you can have a variety. Those are the main types, but you can have multiple types within a category, right? And then you could have a whole like lengthy spectrum. There could be a whole long line of different types of districts that you can have in your community as a whole, beyond just those first three that you typically see. This is a site plan map. Basically, it's as the slide says, it's a rendering, drawing, or sketch which shows the arrangement, layout, and design of a proposed use on a single parcel of land, one parcel of land. Basically, it shows everything that's happening on the site. You know, what the building placement is, the parking design, fencing, even lighting and landscaping. Again, it shows it on a single parcel of land, so it's not, a whole block. It's just one parcel of land, and it shows its boundaries as well as the adjacent streets that the site is on. You'll see many of these over your service. Even if you're not approving a site plan application, you'll see many of these because site plans are often needed to review other requests. So even if it's a variance or a special use permit, more than likely you'll be looking at a site plan to do that review for that application. So you'll see a lot of those. This is a subdivision plat. As the definition states, it's a division of any parcel of land into a number of lots, blocks, or sites as specified in a local ordinance, law, rule, or regulation. They may have streets present on the plat. They may not have them. They may have planned streets. It may not have a planned street. Like if someone's just carving up one particular lot, maybe into two, there may not be a need to have a street, but you may have a piece of farmland that was recently sold, and the person that owns it now is going to carve it up and make it into a residential subdivision. Well, you're likely going to need to have some streets in there, so it should be shown on the plat. The subdivision plat may also have the purposes of the sale, and whether it's a transfer of ownership or development as a reason for the subdivision. This map shows basically a large area that's been divided into multiple parcels of land, more than likely for a residential subdivision, and they're labeled into the lots that we commonly refer to in everyday conversation, right? We don't talk about lot, block, and all of that. We typically say, a lot, and that's how these are labeled. Planning boards, like I mentioned earlier, will review these as required by New York State statute. Sorry, ZBA. This is just for the planning boards. But the ZBA may review a variance application in connection to a subdivision plat on occasion. So you may still see a subdivision plat as like a reference document, ZBA members, but you won't be deciding on a subdivision plat, just the variance that's connected to it. Subdivision plats always include detailed measurements of the lot or parcel that, again, define the shape, usually in degrees. And I don't know if you can see my little arrow here. And you cannot see this because it's so small, but there's a numerical description of the lot at different points, and I won't get into all of that. It's part of the legal description. I won't get into it because it's confusing. It can be confusing even if you already know how to do it. But it's a description of the shape of that parcel in degrees. Again, the subdivision plat may or may not include proposed streets, but it should show lot lines. As you can see, for all these lots included here, you can see the lot lines. It should show the existing adjacent streets, like up here. I believe that's what that is. And it should also show where utility lines will be placed, whether that's, water or sewer. It should show where they're going to be placed and the specifics regarding the type and size. So if it's a water main, what size water main? It's 6-inch water main will be placed at the front, and this easement up here, it should be labeled, okay? And if streets are shown, it should include the shape. It shouldn't be just a line. It should be the actual shape and width of and the width labeled on that plat. So we want to see the dimensions as well and the shape. It's important to note that the goal in subdivision reviewing subdivision applications is that you want to avoid creating lots that are unsuitable for development, right? And that's like situations where either the placement makes it inaccessible in general, or maybe inaccessible for like maybe emergency vehicles or something like that, or it would fail to meet the dimensional requirements regarding lot size and step backs if somebody did want to develop on it. It kind of, if subdividing this piece of property makes it harder for that, not easy for that person to develop it, it's probably not wise to subdivide it, right? Unless it's just going to be carved off and have no use. It's going to be preserved. Maybe you want to do a conservation easement or something like that. It's going to be public land, recreational space, what have you. Unless it's something like that, it doesn't make sense, right? So you want to think critically about those subdivision applications, and again, avoid creating lots that are unsuitable for development. It'll make it harder to develop them, even after they've been subdivided. This is a great resource. This is the Seeker EAF Mapper. For those of you who are on boards now, we have you muted, but in my heart I heard you cringe. Don't be afraid. Please don't poison the well with the new members. Seeker is nothing to be afraid of, and we have a whole show dedicated to it where we break it down and we talk about some of the changes that have been made recently to help make it a lot easier. But the Seeker EAF Mapper is part of what makes the Seeker review so much easier these days. It was developed by the Department of Environmental Conservation, and it's a great tool, again, to make the process easier. It's an information gathering process, and the way that the EAF Mapper relates to it or connects to it is kind of like a clearinghouse of information. All you do is just punch in the address, and the mapper helps the applicant answer questions in the part one of either the long or short environmental assessment form. It saves time and money because the information that's needed is all in one place. They just put the address into the website, and what comes out is a variety of information that comes from a variety of sources or resources that they did not have to find themselves, right? And it's much more accurate information. It's up to date, and it has a variety of information that it provides. It can tell the applicant about endangered species that are on the site in question, unique archaeological sites, and a variety of other things that, again, it would be difficult, time-consuming, labor-intensive, and if not, in some cases, financially prohibitive for them to come up with this information on their own. So it's a really great resource, and it does make the process a lot simpler. One thing to keep in mind, however, is if you do decide to go to this website, which I strongly suggest you do, and just kind of play around with it, punch in an address and see what kind of information you can get about a particular site, just keep in mind that it may take a little while to process. Remember, this is a kind of a clearinghouse of information. It's pulling information from a lot of different sources, so it takes a little while to create the report, sometimes up to a couple of minutes. So don't give up. Just let it do what it does, and then in the end, it'll plop out the information that you need. Here's a few other mapping resources. The GIS Clearinghouse. It's basically It has some good information that you can download, or you can download data from it if you have GIS. And that's for those folks. I mean, if you're technically savvy, you could certainly use that website. If you're not, you can still go and play around with it and see what you can find from it. Another resource is from the Office of Planning and Development within the Department of State, otherwise known as OPD. We have a GIS gateway. It offers a lot of water-specific data sets, so it's valuable. It's a good resource for those folks that come from waterfront communities, or those communities that are submitting an application to the OPD that require a consistency review from either us at DOS or the Army Corps of Engineers. But it provides data sets on inland waterways, coastal waterways, et cetera. So again, if you're a waterfront community, this is a great resource to have in your back pocket. And I will pass this on to Chris to talk about preparing for meetings.
Thanks, Ebony. And I just noticed that we have only about a quarter of the time left, and a little more than half the presentation to go. So, or about half the presentation to go. So I promise not to ramble the way I did on my last slides. I'll try to get through them quickly. So one of the skills, among the skills for board members that we look for in board members, or skills that will serve you well, are being prepared for meetings and just being organized. So make sure, and I'm going to emphasize on this slide, I'm not going to go through all the points, but making sure, especially if you have a busy agenda, that you have a quorum and that you won't have to put your applicants off a month. Make sure you have that quorum so that you are ready to go. And if you have quorum troubles, then maybe you need to have some members cycle off and new members come on, or you need alternates for absences. Of course, there is a provision in statute to appoint alternates in situations of conflicts of interest, but if you want alternates, if you want to appoint alternates for if members are just absent in order to have a meeting, you have to supersede statute and use your home rule authority, municipal home rule power to adopt a law to allow for alternates in the case of absences, and we have samples of those. I also want to emphasize on the second bullet, the chair should prepare the meeting agenda and decide the order of applications, prioritizing based on what makes sense, including leaving maybe the more complex and controversial applications for later on, taking care of the applications that'll be really quick right at the outset. So, but that's for you to decide. I know I've been in meetings where people who are present at the meeting who to present their application have to wait for a bunch of long applications, and then theirs takes 5 minutes. It feels unfair to make them wait throughout the meeting. And I should emphasize now, when we at a time of when we're having a lot of remote meetings and hybrid meetings, that you should emphasize you should try to encourage people who are attending remote. You should try and encourage as many people to attend remotely as possible, so you don't have problems with to have to turn people away when we're social distancing. So I'll leave that slide there. If anybody has questions, and we do have 2 questions in the chat box. I encourage others to just put your questions in, and we'll get to those before we close out. Even if we have to skip a few slides, we'll get to your questions. So I just want to encourage everybody here. I want to emphasize the more friendly and easy to navigate your review process, the better the reputation of your boards will have, the better the reputation your boards will have. And you can almost, we often say, you can ask for a little more if your review process is efficient. If you have high expectations of your applicants, if your municipality really has lofty goals in terms of what you expect from in design and materials, for example, if your site plan review laws go further than most, your applicants will appreciate an efficient process. They won't appreciate, even if they get everything they want, if you drag them through months of review, and if it's a moving target, they won't love that. So another quality that makes a good board member is an inclination toward efficiency. And that efficiency is knowing how the process goes. So if you're on your zoning board of appeals, know how the planning board works, and vice versa. Know how know how to be able to advise applicants who don't know the process. And that's all I'll say about that. If anybody has questions, write them into the chat box. And of course, reviewing application materials. Board members should receive application materials at least a week in advance, and they should, one of the worst things for a board chair or a municipal staff is when board members show up and they open up their packet. A lot of us receive our packets electronically these days, and we should start reviewing them long before the meeting, visit the property, and really know what we're reviewing. And to really be thorough about knowing what we're reviewing, consider, especially for more complex applications, if necessary, an agenda setting meeting or workshop. The board I used to staff, my first planning job, had regular workshops a couple days before the meeting itself, and then the one I staffed for a number of years as a permanent employee, the first one was contract staff, they didn't have an agenda setting meeting or workshop, and some of the meetings themselves were excruciating because board members didn't know what was being requested and how to respond to it. And so we started having a workshop session, a work session half an hour before the meeting itself. That work session was subject to the open meetings law, but we didn't allow applicants to speak during it because it was not for deliberation, but so that the board understood the applications and had the opportunity to ask each other and the staff what was being requested and what the implications were for those requests in the context of the regulations. And so another quality that makes great board members is those members who ask questions and aren't afraid to reveal that they don't understand something. So inquisitiveness is an important quality for board members. So just a little bit about working with planning and enforcement staff, and I'll really emphasize because I know most small towns and villages don't have planning staff. But you have the ability, of course, to call on your county planning boards, your county planning agencies, the staff, and potentially board members as well, and to take their responses. But the staff is there even for questions that don't pertain to questions of countywide impact. They are professionals who have a lot of experience in what you're dealing with, and they're there to help you, as are we. So but you should understand the importance of your enforcement staff to local governments. I talked to a friend of mine who's on his planning board in the North Country just a few days ago, and it seems that his board doesn't, and members of the community don't fully understand the role of the enforcement official. And they expected him, as a member of the planning board, to function in an enforcement capacity. So you board members have to understand the importance of your enforcement staff to the integrity of your zoning regulations and your local government in general. And because many of you represent small municipalities with limited staff, it helps that you have an inclination toward volunteer work when there's a need for that and a lack of planning staff. I serve on an advisory board for a local government that has planning staff, but they're understaffed, and I find myself doing a lot of volunteer work. I just recently put together a new application because the application we were using was so frequently incomplete, and sometimes the staff didn't realize that applicants were not completing large portions of the application, and we were having to go back and ask for more information before we ruled on the applications before us. Back to Ebony on site visits, an extension of what we've been talking about. No.
Okay. So I'll try to go through these fairly quickly. Conducting a site visit is a really good way to get your bearings and see how a site works or doesn't work in real life, not only on paper. You get details and information from being on site that you just cannot get just by reading the application and the supplemental documents that come along with it. The idea is to observe when you go to do a site visit, not make decisions or compare notes with colleagues or snoop. You do want to go individually. That's really the best method to do it. If you're going to do a site visit, go by yourself, or at the very most, go in groups of no more than groups of 2 at a time, because you want to be aware of not. You want to. How can I say it? You want to not have a quorum. Right, because if you have a quorum, that means that you're actually having a meeting. If you have a quorum, that means you're trying to have a meeting, and having a meeting requires notice to the public and access by the public, right? And so if more than 2 of you go, if a number of you go to the site at the same time, and that constitutes having a meeting because you have a quorum, you're in hot water, right? Because there are certain standards that have to be met that you have not done so, that you have not met. So I just say go individually if you're going to go at all, and just keep it easy, keep it simple. You want to keep your comments to yourself. You can take notes at a site visit, but you don't want to discuss what you're observing with your colleagues, with the colleagues that may be present there with you. You want to follow up with staff if you have comments or questions about your observations. You do not want to have that discussion outside of a public forum with your colleagues on the board. So you want to avoid taking comments also from comments or questions from neighbors or passersby during your site visit. Somebody may walk by and see you and wave and come over and talk to you about what they know about that person or the applicant or the site. You want to avoid that. You want to direct them if they have some. You want to let them know that if they have something that they'd like to share, they can do so at the public hearing or the public meeting, or excuse me, rather at the public hearing. If they want to know more information about the application, they can come to the public meeting and get more information at that time. But you can't discuss it because, of course, that could be viewed as ex parte communication, right? And that's not something that you want to be guilty of. It's not illegal, but again, it's not something that you want to be engaged in, right? Let's see, moving on. You also want to have an organized approach when you're doing a site visit. You want to know what you want to look at. You want to have an idea of what you want to kind of pay attention to while you're there to make the most efficient use of your time while you're there present. So you want to consider maybe dividing the site visit considerations into at least 2 categories. Maybe you say, okay, I'm going to look at things on the parcel itself, like the terrain, presence of any natural buffers. Maybe you'll evaluate how the proposed development will connect to any existing structure that you're seeing on the site. You know, you can walk the site and get a feel for that. Maybe you want to look at the existing curb cuts and see what those look like on the site now, and then maybe the ones on adjacent properties, maybe across the street or next door, to see whether they, you know, whether there's good clearance, etc. Maybe you want to walk the internal roadway and see what the condition of that is in, and then or you also want to look at adjacent uses or views or impacts. So that's the second category. You know, you want to look at what's happening next door. You want to take a look at the vista. You know, will the proposed development take away a valued scene, a valued view of, that exists today? Again, looking at traffic. Looking at whether there are any sensitive or protective uses that are next door that would be impacted adversely by the presence of this development in the manner in which it's been applied for. Again, you also want to use your checklist. This is something that comes in handy because your checklist should be organized and detailed, you know, having those review elements there that you need to be looking for when you're reviewing the application. You can use that to, you know, help you figure out, you know, help you to remember what to look at as you're on your site visit. Because again, those review elements are key. That's what you need to be thinking about anyway. So usually, you know, when I would do site visits, it was important for me to know what I was going to look for before I even got there. I wanted to know before I went, or know before you go. So I usually had specific things that I wanted to observe on the site. Sometimes I was there to gather new information or perspective, but sometimes I was there to verify information that I already had. But it made it, it was much more efficiently done when I had that, when I knew what I wanted to do, what my purpose was well in advance, and so I could get there, get it done, and get on. So I'm not spending a lot of time at the site. Other on-site considerations, these are some other questions that you could consider, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but these are just kind of common sense questions to ask yourself. You don't have to be technical. You don't have to be an engineer. A lot of this stuff is just common sense and critical thinking. You know, you go on the site, do you smell or see or hear anything unusual? You know, does the proposed location of the structure or the driveway, does that make sense? Is it a lot wetter or drier on the site than you thought it would be? Just use your imagination, not use your imagination in the sense that you should kind of pull things out of thin air, but just, you know, think critically about what's happening on the site, the terrain, and what the applicant is proposing and how that might fit with what's happening in the area already. Here's a larger perspective. You know, here's where this is when you'll kind of think about the site in the context of the surrounding neighborhood or community, right? Are there common vegetation or trees in the community? Are there good views? Are there sidewalks? Are they in good condition? You know, the idea here is to think about what the proposed development will need to fit in, to be a good fit in this part of the neighborhood or this part of the community. And when you're doing a site visit, one thing I want to mention here is that in general, it's good to avoid being hosted by the applicant. And by that, I mean having the applicant be there to kind of walk you through the site and, you know, kind of do a Vanna White kind of thing, you know, just kind of explaining to you what their goal and their vision is for the proposed project and all of that. That's wonderful, but it's challenging to do that because, of course, they're going to have their own way of presenting the information in the most favorable manner, and it's going to be hard for them to be circumspect, and it's going to be hard for you to avoid appearing influenceable while also being polite at the same time. So it's best to just kind of go on your own without the applicant kind of leading you on, you know, leading you through the site, just so you can kind of see things for yourself and get a feel for it on your own. And here we are again talking about ex parte communication. We've already talked about this a little bit in the ethics section. It's not illegal, but again, it can, when you do it, it can frame perceptions about your integrity if you're having conversations with an applicant outside of a public forum, outside of the public's view. Okay, like I said, it's not illegal, but it can frame perceptions that would be negative. So you want to avoid those discussions outside of the public realm. If you do have contact, maybe someone approaches you and asks you a question, you want to disclose that. You want to redirect that person, redirect the applicant to staff, or to staff or to the actual meeting to, pose their question or their comment at the time when you have the meeting. But no matter how you kind of deflect that person, when you get to the final meeting, when you do get to the meeting, you want to let them know that the contact occurred. So you want to disclose that contact for the record. You also want to avoid discussing applications via email with outsiders or fellow board members. Again, you want to avoid even the appearance of a conflict of interest. And so to avoid this, you want to avoid those conversations with a polite referral to staff if the applicant has a concern or question, and then just leave it at that. And I will pass it on to Chris, who will quickly talk about what to do in the meeting.
Thanks, Ebony. I jumped the gun a little on a couple of these. I started talking about quorum a little earlier, and when I probably went a little more into detail than the slide called for. But a quorum, the definition of quorum is the number of members legally needed to conduct business, and that's a majority of the fully constituted board. And again, the ability to appoint alternates for conflicts of interest is in statute, but to appoint alternates for mere absences, you need to adopt a local law, supersede statute, and adopt a local law creating the position of alternates for your board. To assist your board in not having quorum problems, your role as a great board member should be to attend as many meetings as possible and to notify the chair and or staff when you can't in advance of the meeting to be sure that everybody else is available. And I have a story that I often tell that I'll save in the interest of time. The difference between public meetings and public hearings is public meetings, it's a convening of the board to conduct public business, and meetings you're not required at a public meeting to allow the public to speak. You may, and it's often a good idea, but maybe not in your agenda session, in your workshop where you're just discussing the points of the application and not the merits of the application. Public hearings are for the public to speak. And remember, there's great value in that. The more you learn about a project and an area, the area where the project's proposed, the better your decisions will be. The reason for public hearings is to hear from the public. They're required for all matters in front of a zoning board of appeals, and for most in front of a planning board. Statutorily for subdivision, special use permits, and many local governments require public hearings for site plans as well, but site plan is not does not require site plan review does not require public hearings by statute. I jumped the gun on this one too, and I just updated the slide. It's not updated in your handouts. The executive order allowing for remote public hearings and remote public meetings and public hearings was extended by Executive Order 202.60 until October 4th. And it's a best practice. I know a lot of boards are doing this. They're holding hybrid meetings where there are a few people on site, but they give the public and members of the board the ability to attend remotely, and that way people who are really concerned about exposure can participate. But 2 tips on that. I made the one already, and that is to encourage people to attend remotely so that you don't run into the problem of having to turn people away because you've reached capacity for social distancing, because those people who show up to the meeting might not have the ability to go online really quickly. So encourage people to participate online, and encourage them to participate remotely, and encourage them to send their comments in ahead of time by email. I know this just from my own experience doing these webinars. You saw earlier I was distracted by one of the comments. I couldn't read it and present at the same time. So it might be easier for your board to receive, if you can, send them comments by email in advance before the meeting if you want to participate in the hearing or the meeting as it's going on based on what's been said. That's fine too. That's one of the criteria for having a remote public meeting and public hearing, is for real-time interaction by the public. And finally, we've been trying to get the governor's office to make these extensions longer than 1 month, maybe till the end of the year. We think, and every month they're extended right at the deadline, right when. So this one, we probably won't have another extension until Monday, October 5th. We believe that the ability to hold public meetings and hearings remotely will continue for months. So if that's what you're planning, don't worry about it. You're probably fine. And if you follow all the measures of holding remote public meetings and hearings, and we can share those with you if you need those details, we can send them your way, you're probably fine. And there is even a movement afoot, I've heard from our colleagues at the Committee on Open Government and elsewhere, to make some kind of ability to hold remote public meetings and hearings permanent. So lots of changes as a result of the emergencies of 2020. Just some tips on holding public hearings: be courteous and respectful to those speaking. Avoid body language that suggests your opinions about what the speaker is saying. And be open to the public's comments, because they will help you make better decisions. Consultants can be helpful in their perspective and their experience to your boards for complex applications, comprehensive planning, and zoning revisions. And I'm just going to go on to the next slide to get into it a little more deeply. They work for you, remember, and you as board members should be sure that just because your municipality might be paying for help doesn't mean you're off the hook entirely and all the work is going to be done by the consultants. You should not check out of the process. You should continue your engagement and make sure, hold those consultants to task. And there is the ability, as many of you might know, sometimes we don't know the source of the ability to hire professional project review services, but there's a comptroller's opinion that says that local boards may hire professional review for complex applications that require professional assistance. And the costs of these services should be written into your local regulation by your local governing board, and your local governing board should give you, as a planning board, or as it happens, the zoning board of appeals, usually this will be planning board, the ability to ask for those pre-established fees based on the complexity of the application. It might be on the cost of the project, a percentage of the cost of the project, because volunteer board members don't necessarily have the experience of a radio frequency engineer to review an application for a telecommunications facility, or the financial background to review the fairness of a payment in lieu of taxes deal for a solar facility, or the environmental engineering background for a project that will result in stormwater discharge, or for that matter, solar. I think I'm going to turn control of the screen back to Ebony. Ebony, feel free to skip through slides if you choose, so that we can make sure we finish and have a few minutes to talk over some of the questions that have come in.
Okay, I think we've, between Paul and I think there was only maybe 2 questions and we both answered them. So I don't think we have any others unless I've missed them, but I will still do my best to skip through here. Don't be afraid to ask questions. I mean, it's better to ask questions than to make misinformed decisions with a long shelf life, right? I mean, you're going to have to, your community's going to live with your decisions as a board member or as a board for a long time. And so it's better to ask, and as opposed to have to live with a decision that was poorly made. So please do that. You're a lay person. You're not expected to be an expert. Although you are expected to, learn in your service, you're not expected to be an expert. So it's okay to request legal assistance or land use assistance from staff, the municipal attorney, consultants, county and regional planners, us, the Department of State, etc. However, you are an expert in your community, right? And that plus, your application of your code, your laws, your comprehensive plan, that is what arms you to make good decisions. And I think Heather mentioned that earlier. It's absolutely true. Applying your laws and you being the expert on your community is all you need to have to equip you to do this job well. You want to be clear and direct with applicants. Applicants definitely appreciate it if your regulations are clear, even if they hold them to a high standard. At the end of the day, this can be, going through the process of having a land use application reviewed, pulling together all that information, submitting it, and waiting with bated breath for the answer can be quite frustrating for applicants, especially when they have a significant amount of investment at stake. But if the answer that they provide, that the board provides them, whether it be yes or no, and the rationale for that decision, if it's laid out clearly, takes away some of that frustration. At the very least, even if they disagree, they'll know what they can do to now move forward, right? To correct the application, change whatever needs to be changed, and resubmit at a later date if that's available, if that's an option available to them. So being clear and direct can definitely take the edge off of a lot of denials, a lot of requests for additional information, etc. Even if you only have a few applications a year, every now and again there will be like an application that comes before you that has a lot of public interest, even if it's not necessarily controversial. But even still, you may have to interact with the media. And if you don't have a media plan in place, you should consider developing one, because it'll help you, it'll lay out for you how you'll handle questions and comments from the media, how you will deal with them. A couple of key points: you want to decide on a response plan. How are you going to handle calls? How are you going to do press releases? Will you have news conferences when there's a really controversial application before your board? Who will be the spokesperson? Typically, that should be the chair, and from what I have seen in practice. But also, let's say the chair isn't the most comfortable with public speaking. They're the chair, but this is a skill that they are still growing in. Maybe there's someone else that's better at that, or better fielding questions on your board. Designate who that person should be, and how that will be decided. Right. You also want to, just as a matter of practice, put your controversial issues at the top of your agenda. Those issues those applications on your agenda that have a lot of public interest, where you expect a lot of people to show up, have them start at the very beginning of the meeting, of the new business of the meeting, and allow those people that show up en masse to not have to wait till the end of the meeting to hear what they came to talk about. And the media as well, right? So the media, the public, whomever are interested in these issues, let it be front and center at the top of the agenda and get it over and done with, so people don't have to wait the whole time. Were you going to say something?
I just thought maybe what we should do at this point is to allow Heather, who is a fan of this course, and I hope we haven't let her down by running out of time at the end here, to ask us to focus on the slides that remain that she feels are most important, and to draw attention to those herself, and to throw anything in at this point that she might want to. So Heather, are you able to do that? I see that you're still muted. Do you want to say anything at this point? We've had a couple. There we are. Good.
No, I think you guys have done a great job. And just to have the ability to have the slides available afterwards for board members to share with their compatriots in arms, other board members, would be great. I don't have my printed version in front of me, so I'll leave it up to you guys to, if there's any salient points at the end.
Well, Ebony, why don't we skip the making your decisions stick slide, since we go over these in most of our presentations. Okay. And I'll maybe highlight a few of the ones at the end. Oh, you've handed control of the screen back to me. A quorum is needed for the vote, and a majority of the fully constituted board is required for decisions. Findings support your decisions. They connect the law to the facts of the case, and the record is the story of the application. And just some advice in closing: be diligent and do your job. Know the comprehensive plan and your regulations. Be respectful to your colleagues and your applicants, and know the law, and be enthusiastic about what you're doing. I think that enthusiasm will translate into, one hopes, respect by applicants for you as volunteers. And I'll just stay on this slide for a minute. You can take a look at where you can go for further assistance, and we'll just go through a couple of the questions and then close down. One of the questions was if board members can be sued personally for decisions. Paula did answer that in the chat. You'd have to work really hard. You'd have to be malicious to be held personally liable. Most of the time when the board is challenged, it's the board and the municipality that are challenged. It's a tough enough job, and nobody would do it if they were liable personally. We have, you should have received a printed version of the slides. Heather has a copy, so you can email Heather for the PDF of the slides if you somehow didn't receive them. Maybe you registered after we distributed them. I think we distributed them this morning, or possibly yesterday. And there was a request for us to consider a course in Robert's Rules of Order. That was an interesting request. We probably won't get to it right away. If we do, it would be to merge some of that information into our public meetings and hearings course. I think there is value in it, although our attorneys have often emphasized that boards are not bound to Robert's Rules of Order. And then there was a question that I think Ebony answered about being in a small community and how to avoid conflicts of interest. I had that experience myself where I was in front of a board for a small subdivision and I knew half of them, or most of them. I'd had personal dealings with most of them, but they're approving or disapproving the application. They didn't have any financial interest in that. So you might know one another, but it's really ethics comes down to financial interest. And if one of the board members stands to profit personally from a decision. If that's the case, the board member should recuse him or herself. And abstentions from votes, why abstain from a vote? That would only be to not reveal your opinion about something. So an abstention is the equivalent of a no vote, and it doesn't really help. Here's our contact information. Sorry to rush through those last few slides. And we are available for by email. That's the best email address to use. These days we're not in our office. We're still working from home because our office building is so densely populated that they want to keep us, who can do just about everything we do normally except travel and see you in person. We can do all other aspects of our jobs remotely, and so we are still remote. Send us an email or leave a message on our machine. It'll get picked up by our secretary, and she'll distribute that to us. And Heather put her email into the chat box, so use that one as well. And Heather and Ebony, do you have anything in closing to say to our audience?
No, I'll just echo what Heather said before and what we mentioned in the presentation, is that you have all that you need to do this job well. You have your knowledge of your community, and then you have your codes, your comprehensive plan, your regulations, and of course you have your county planners and your local planners there to support you along the way. So you have everything that you need to do a good job in this role, and you will.
Yeah, and just a thank you to the Department of State team for putting this together. I love these slides. And for my fellow people in land use, you got this, you can do it, and the planning department of any of your counties is there to help. And go forth and plan.
Thanks, Heather, for that support and for having us and for gathering such a good group of attendees. We had quite a few people on tonight. And stay tuned for our statewide webinars and check our schedule for those. And thank you all for your service on your boards. Good night.